So I'm glad to be here because we're getting to the final conclusion of the story of Joseph. And this is really part of my favorite. The whole reason we look at this study is just how God works through this situation. So I want to begin by looking at the word restore. According to the dictionary, it's a verb. It means to bring back into existence, use, or the like, reestablish, to restore order. To bring back to a former, original, or normal condition as a building, statue, or painting. To bring back to a state of health, soundness, or vigor. To put back to a former place or former position, rank, to restore the king to his throne. To give back, make, return, or restitution, anything taken away or lost. There is something so positive about the words restore and restoration. It speaks of taking something that has been lost, stolen, ruined, or destroyed, and bringing it back to its original state that it was intended for. So we restore pictures, homes, buildings, archaeological sites, artwork, albums, movies, books, furniture, and a vast array of anything else. And I really like this picture as an example of restoration. It's taking something that's been ruined and restoring it to what it was intended for. But see, restoration is not just something we do to things, because it applies to people as well. People may be restored in life after making mistakes. People can be restored after experiencing some really difficult times. Relationships can be restored through love and forgiveness. And all of us who have been tainted by sin can be restored, and our lives can be made full and whole. So today, as we arrive at kind of the climax of this series of messages on Joseph in the narratives of Genesis, right, we saw how God had given him, or he had received a robe of potential, that multicolored, technicolor dream coat, whatever you want to call it, but it was stripped away by his brothers when he was sold into slavery. Then he was given a robe of slavery and suffering, but God blessed him through those series of trials and hardship. But now we see that he is given a robe of restoration. He is elevated to the governor of all of Egypt. And we're going to see how this restoration and how God applies this restoration in three ways. First, as redemption, personal healing, and relational healing. So now this is going to be the longest section we look at. There's a lot I want to cover from chapter 41 all the way to chapter 50. I probably hit mostly just some high points and narrate the rest. So we begin in chapter 41. Now Joseph was left in prison. If you remember, he gave the interpretation to the cupbearer and then asked the cupbearer, when you're restored, speak to me before Pharaoh. Tell him what I have done, what I've been through, and perhaps he'd hear my case. But as soon as the cupbearer was restored, and likely, right, he just got out of serious trouble with Pharaoh, could have lost his life, he's probably not wanting to bring up anything else. He's just glad to have his job back. And it says that 2 years had passed from that moment. But then one night, Pharaoh has this set of dreams, 2 dreams. They're vivid. They're very disturbing to him. He has one, he wakes up, and then he falls back asleep, and he has another. And his dream was that there were 7 sleek cows that were fat and healthy, and then 7 ugly cows consume the 7 fat cows, just like the happy cow. It just makes me happy. So these happy fat cows are then consumed by the ugly cows. Then he has another dream of 7 healthy, plentiful heads of grain on a single stalk, but then 7 scorched and meager heads consume the 7 good heads of grain. And when he wakes from this, he's in a sweat. He's bothered. He's disturbed. And he calls in all his advisors, all his counselors, all his magicians to tell him what these dreams mean. But nobody was able to. And so then the cupbearer says, King, there was a time, I didn't want to bring it up because you were mad at me, but there was a guy, a Hebrew in prison, and we had dreams, and he accurately interpreted it. It came just as he said it would. So they send for Joseph. And when they bring him into the room and they shave him because his beard's all scraggly, and Egyptians, it's really interesting. I don't know why I study these things, but Egyptians were like hairless. They preferred no hair. So they would shave, they would even shave their eyebrows and like paint them back on. And so because he was going to go into the presence of Pharaoh, they basically do him all up to make him look presentable, because there was a little bit of this racism in which the Egyptians felt like they were the most superior and Hebrews were kind of less than, and they didn't think it was appropriate for someone to look like a Hebrew to be in the presence of the Pharaoh, so they made him look like an Egyptian. Now, Pharaoh says, I've heard you can interpret dreams. And Joseph kind of stuns the room into silence and says, I cannot, but God can. God is the one who interprets the dreams. He said, tell me your dreams. And so Pharaoh recounts the dreams. And as Joseph hears it, he gives an accurate interpretation. We'll pick up there. And he basically says, right, they're one in the two. So verse 28, it is just as I said to Pharaoh, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because the famine that follows is so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. And then, after he interprets the dream, Joseph decides to give a little bit of counsel, some advice to Pharaoh, and he says this, Now let the Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food, all those good years that are coming, and store up the grain under the authority of the Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. The food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by famine. Now, when Pharaoh hears Joseph's advice, he says this in verse 37. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh, and he asked all his officials, and Pharaoh asked, can we find anyone like this man on whom the Spirit of God is the Spirit of God? And so then Pharaoh says to Joseph, since God has made this known to you, there's no one so discerning and wise as you. You will be in charge of my palace and all my people, and to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Right? I love the fact that the Pharaoh recognizes God's Spirit in Joseph, recognizes that he is a Hebrew and the God of the Hebrews has given this. So Pharaoh put Joseph in charge, And he says, I put you in charge of the whole land. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger, dressed him in a robe of fine linen. So here we get the 3 robes. And then put a gold chain around his neck. He even gave him a chariot as he was to ride through the city, and there would be runners in front of these chariots, and these runners would be saying, bow the knee, bow the knee. And so as Joseph would ride through a city, everybody would fall on their knees before him in respect. The signet ring is important. This is King Tut's signet ring that was recovered. The signet ring bears the authority of the Pharaoh. It has his cartouche on it. And so any official documents, any official rules, anything, that gave him the authority and the power to make it happen. And if he had that ring and stamps it on any document, it then bears the mark of the Pharaoh himself. And so Joseph goes from being in this place of a forgotten prisoner to being elevated to the highest possible office in the land. Aside from being Pharaoh, there was nobody who had as much authority and power and honor as Joseph. In one night, Joseph's entire life changed for the better. He was elevated from being the prisoner to being the most important. And after all those years of suffering, hurt, waiting, confusion, and patience have now come to an end. Joseph has been restored. And this restoration is equivalent to his redemption. You see, God saved his life and changed it in a way that was far better than anything he might have thought or imagined. And keep in mind, 13 years, because he's introduced at the very beginning as 17, and it says that he is 30 in verse 46 when all this happens. So in these 13 years, I mean, just think about that. The older I get, 13 years doesn't sound like very long. But 13 years is quite a long time. Quite a long time of being forgotten, of being humbled, of knowing that he had a family and God had a purpose for him, and yet at every turn he was met with disappointment. 13 years of God shaping him and forming him. But now suddenly, those dreams that he initially gave him when he was 17 years old, that he would be great and his brothers would bow down to them, was becoming a reality. Now, before we move on to the next part, this is so important. Realize that redemption is restoration. It's salvation. You see, when God restores you, it is an act of redemption from slavery and despair. When God restores you, he does it in such a way that only God can get all the glory. Just as Joseph acknowledged to Pharaoh, I can't do it, but God can. And Pharaoh recognized that this is the God of Joseph that has given this to him. When God restores you, he does it completely and totally. And when God restores you, it results in a life change for the better. And so the first step of restoration always involves redemption, and that redemption begins with salvation. So we see restoration begins with that moment of life change. What God does in us when he takes us when we're sinners and we've lived lives of mistakes, lived lives for ourselves, and he redeems us. He sets us free from the bondage of sin and death and gives us a new life and a new hope. But it's not just a matter of he saves us. You see, restoration is also a matter of personal healing. Look with me in verses 50 and 52 of chapter 41. It says, before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asnath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, it is because God has made me forget all the trouble and all my father's household. Then he named his second son Ephraim, and he said, it's because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. So God had elevated Joseph to this position of authority and honor. He was perfectly suited for the job, and he did it excellently. They stored up grain in the cities near the fields where it was harvested, and they stored so much, it says it was like sand. There was just so much grain, it was beyond measure. At first, they started counting it, and after a while, they couldn't even keep count of it. There was so much. In addition, Pharaoh gave Joseph a wife, Asnath, the daughter of Potiphera, the priest of On. And she had 2 sons. And I mentioned this last week, but I just want to come back to it again and again. Manasseh, his firstborn son, it is because God has made me forget all the trouble in my father's household. And then he says the second one is that God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. You see, the naming of his 2 sons is so significant because it represents a monumental moment for Joseph personally. You see, God caused him to forget the pain and the suffering. This does not mean he doesn't remember it anymore. He doesn't remember what happened. He doesn't remember how his brothers plotted to kill him and betrayed him and then ultimately sold him as a slave. Rather, he was healed from those wounds, and that pain was no longer there. He was healed in that he now understood that God allowed him to go through all those trials, and he could look back and make sense of it. Here's how I see this personal healing. In fact, I was just looking at this as I was driving the other day. I have a scar on my hand. I was 10 or 11, and I was being stupid with something sharp, and I ended up nicking myself there. And I can still see that scar. I still remember when I got the cut. But you know what? It doesn't hurt. I can't feel it anymore. And this is the way that God brings healing. Sometimes it takes time. But when God brings it about, that pain, that wound, that cut, that experience, what that person said, you never forget those things. I remember, growing up, I was taught, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That is just simply not true. I want to take the person that came up with that saying, tie them. Well, no, I don't want to be violent, but I want to hurt them because it's not true. I was teased. I was a kid that didn't fit in. I was bullied. I wasn't physically bullied, but I was constantly made fun of. Never felt like I fit in. I was told, in fact, I tell people this all the time. Look, I was held back in 2nd grade because I started school too early, like a year early, so they held me back. I'll never forget the day as the kids were going to the next teacher to see what next year classroom will be in. My teacher said, Alan, why don't you sit behind and help me with something? And from that point on, the rest of my elementary school years, I was known as the kid that failed 2nd grade. I was also diagnosed with a learning disability. It was the 1980s. That's about all they told me, just learning disability. Now it's very precise. And I was put in special classes for kids that were slow. In the 6th grade, I was in a 4th grade spelling book and an 11th grade reading book. And I still can't math to this day. And they teased me. And that carried on all the way through high school. And I was constantly being told by teachers, by other people, then they would say, well, it's not that you're stupid, it's just that it takes you longer to learn things. But that's not what all the other kids would say. You want to hurt me today? Call me stupid. Because I believed I was stupid. I believed I was a mistake, that I should have never been born. And friends, while I've never forgotten the words that were said, the things that happened, God has done so much in my life that I don't feel it the way I used to. It's healed. There may be scars, but there's healing. One of the greatest gifts that God gives is that gift of forgetfulness. Not forget that it ever happened, but you forget the pain. That's healing. The other is that he named his son fruitful. That's what Ephraim means. It means doubly fruitful. And he said, because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. Don't miss that either, because it's not just a matter of him forgetting all the pain of what he had went through, but it was also recognizing how God, in the midst of it all, how God had blessed him. Even when he wasn't aware, even when he had no idea. So he's sold as a slave, but then he's elevated as the top slave in Potiphar's house. Then he's thrown into prison and he's elevated to the top prisoner in charge of the whole prison. Now he's elevated to the top position in Egypt and he's over the entire land. And in every step of the way, God was blessing him. Just as he's working, just who he is, how God had been working through him, everything he touched prospered. Friends, God may bring you through some difficult times. You may have some challenges in your life. I have found in my own life too, there's been times when it felt like God was distant and I was frustrated, I was disappointed, I was struggling, and yet it was sometimes in those moments that God was blessing and I wasn't even aware. You see, God may bring us through difficult times. God may bring us through some core-shaking difficulties. But he does so to bless us, to use us. Some of the people I've been blessed by the most in my life were people, you wouldn't know their names. Sometimes it was in the beds of ICU rooms. Sometimes it was a senior adult with medical problems shut up in their home, and I'd go visit them, and God's blessings would just flow through them. Sometimes it's from unlikely places, but keep in mind, when you're going through things, pay attention. It's like that old hymn we used to sing, count your many blessings, name them one by one. Count your many blessings and see what God has done. Because when you begin to start to see what God is doing, you begin to see what God is doing and how God blesses. Why do we need a Manasseh? Why do we need to heal from past hurts? Because if we don't, you know what it creates? Bitterness. It creates that just everything is wrong. We become those complainers. We become those cranky individuals who are just unhappy in life. And everybody that tries to get close to us, we just drive them away. So if we don't forget, those memories can fester. We need to heal. But we also, once again, when you're going through hardship, it's easy to become bitter. It's easy to feel like we're victims, that everything's just against us. We too need to take an inventory of seeing the ways that God has blessed us. Look for the goodness of God in your life. You may be surprised to realize what he has done. This is good medicine to heal a wounded soul. You see, so God restored Joseph through the redemption, elevating him from a position of being a slave prisoner to being the ruler of the land of Egypt. But also we see how God restored Joseph through the personal healing and the way that God had taken that shattered, wounded person that he would have been. Even though it doesn't talk about it, we know you cannot go through things like what he went through and not be wounded from it. But God had healed him. But here we get to the longest section, and I think the best part of it all. And unfortunately, it is so long, and I only have so long. So I'm going to narrate a lot of it. You please read this. It's so enjoyable to read. You don't have to read it right now, but read it. And also check me, right? Because sometimes I get little details mixed up, and if I do, just say, well, preacher, you said this, but it says this, right? Do that. That's fine. I'm good with that. Right? But one of the things that we're going to see is that restoration is not just salvation. It's not just personal healing. It is relational healing. You see, this is the most important part of it. It brings together the opening dreams of Joseph, the betrayal, the restoration of Jacob's family. It's the most important part of God's restoration. He doesn't just change our situations and heal our personal wounds. He also works in families to bring about a full restoration. In this account, we see Joseph acting with wisdom, not malice. It might seem like he's mad at his brothers and he's trying to make their lives miserable. He's actually just testing them. He's wondering, has his brothers changed? Did they learn their lesson? Did they regret what they did to Joseph? Are they trustworthy? He wants to see if they have remorse and if they've repented. So here's what happens. So the 7 years of plenty, they store up all this grain, and then the 7 years of famine hit. Now, like a famine, that there's no rain, everything begins to dry up, everything begins to wither and die, and it may take a little while for you to feel the effects of a famine, but it's not long until people are getting hungry. Their food stashes are drying up. There's no more grain. And so that's when Joseph opens up the storehouses. And people are able to purchase grain for their families. And now this famine didn't just hit the land of Egypt. It actually spread throughout the entire region. Side note, in seminary, I wrote a paper on who was the Pharaoh of Joseph. I did a whole lot of research, and I found some things. There's a couple things that I found. One, I found the particular time period in which there was a famine, notable famine, all throughout the region. And also that because of that famine, Egypt had grain. They grew wealthy and powerful more than any other nation. And one of the most dominant currencies they had was silver. And all of that stuff is reflected in the story of Joseph. So they begin to start collecting grain. Well, it hits the land of Canaan, where Israel, Jacob, and his sons are all living. And so Jacob says to his sons, why do you just sit here and look at it one another? There's grain in Egypt. Go down there and get us some grain. Now, Joseph's younger brother from his mother is Benjamin. Jacob's not going to let Benjamin out of his sight. He's certainly not going to send him with his older brothers, because last time that brother never came back, Joseph. And so they get their supplies, they take their silver, and they get down to Egypt, and they go to one of the granaries to get their grain, and that Joseph is there overseeing it. They have no idea it's Joseph. That's the last person they would have ever thought. They just figured he was gone. Joseph would have looked fully Egyptian. And here come a group of Hebrew men. And when they come before Joseph, they all bow down with their faces to the ground before him. And he recognizes them perfectly. Now keep in mind, by this time, Joseph knows Egyptian. So he's speaking Egyptian, and he has a translator who is talking to them. You got to pick up on that, because they have no clue. They don't even have an inkling that it's Joseph. And when he sees them, he says, "You all are spies." And they said, what do you mean we're spies? He goes, "You're here looking for weaknesses in our defenses so you can attack us. You're spies." And they're like, "No, we're all brothers, all from one man. And we have another younger brother who's back with his father. We're not spies." He goes, "You are spies. I'm going to throw you in jail." And he puts them all in jail for 3 days. Then he comes back and he says, look, if you're not spies, then you can prove it to me. All of you don't need to stay in jail. I'll just keep one of them. And the rest of you go, and you bring your younger brother back with you. Then I'll know you're telling the truth. And so he takes Simeon. I have my suspicions why Simeon. I think Simeon was a little bit temperamental. He might have been the one that really wanted to kill Joseph. He takes Simeon and puts him in prison and lets the others go. And he instructs his servant, put the silver they paid for their grain back in the mouth of their sacks. And so he lets them go, and they leave. They're glad they're leaving. And when they stop for the night, they decide to get some grain to make some food. And when they open their sacks, there's the silver, and all the color drains out of their faces. And they're like, "No, what is this? We paid for it. Now we got the money. What happened?" Right? And so they go back home, and they tell Jacob all that happened. And Jacob's like, "What's wrong with you guys?" And they said, "Look, he said we will never see his face again unless we bring our youngest brother, so we have to take Benjamin back." He goes, "Not gonna happen. I'm not letting him out of my sight. I've already lost one son. Now I've lost another. I'm not gonna lose him, because if I lose him, it'll kill me." Well, some time elapses. They run out of grain. They start to get hungry again. And Jacob says, "You need to go back to Egypt to get more grain." And they said, "We can't. Not unless we take Benjamin. Benjamin's not leaving my side." Reuben steps up and says, "Well, look, if we take him and something happens, you can kill my 2 sons. I've always wondered, why did he think that was a good answer? If anything happens to Benjamin, you can kill your 2 grandchildren. No. And he's like, "No." And he's like, "Why didn't you even tell them you had a younger brother?" And they're like, "Well, because he asked us all kinds of questions. How's your dad? Is he still alive? How's your younger brother?" Then Judah steps up. And Judah says, "Father, I know how much this means to you. I will take personal responsibility for Benjamin." And Jacob says, "Fine. If I lose him, I lose him. If I die, I die. But before you go back, take the silver for the new grain, take the silver you've already used to buy the grain, and then load up a cart full of all kinds of our goodies, right? Pistachios, almonds, some honey, some all kinds of other nice little things, and take them down there to a gift. Hopefully, he won't be mad at you. And so when they get back down there and they have Benjamin with them, and Joseph sees them, he says to his servant, take them to my house. They're going to eat lunch with me today. And so they're ushered to Joseph's house. And when they get there, they talk to the servant. They're like, look, we got this extra money. It was put back in our sacks. We don't know how it got there. And he's trying to they're like terrified. And the servant says, don't worry, your God has blessed you. And they get them all cleaned up. There's food for their animals, and they go in, and Joseph is there. And I want to pick up in chapter 42. Actually, chapter 43. I got a little further than I thought I was. Verse 26, when Joseph came home, they presented the gifts to him. They bowed into they had brought into the house, and they bowed down before him to the ground. He asked them how they were, and then he said to them, how's your aged father you told me about? Is he still living? And they replied, your servant, our father, is still alive and well. And they bowed down, prostrating themselves before him. And as he looked about, he saw his brother Benjamin, his own mother's son. And he asked, is this your youngest brother? And I thought about that because Benjamin was probably just a little child, just a toddler. He'd never really seen him. Is this the one you told me about? God be gracious to you. And look at verse 30. Deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph ran out of the room and looked for a place to weep. And then he went to his private room and wept. He composes himself, dries off his eyes, splash some water on there, maybe a little bit more mascara. And he goes back in and he prepares them a meal. And he has them seated. So has them seated at their own table. Joseph is at his own table, and any other Egyptians in the house are at their own table because they never associate with each other. But when his brothers go to sit down at their table, they're all seated from oldest to youngest in accurate order. And they look around at each other like, uh-oh. And it says that they all had plenty of food, but he gave to Benjamin 5 times the portion. And he was listening to them because once again, they did not know that it was Joseph. Now, and by the way, I didn't read it, but I wanted to point out that throughout, they're talking among themselves, and several times the brothers say, this is happening to us because of what we did to Joseph. God is punishing us for what we did to our brother. Remember how distressed he was. Remember how scared he was and how we didn't listen to him. All of this is happening to us. And Joseph, every time he heard them talk about it, would begin to weep and would leave. But they're done eating. Their sacks of grain are there, and Joseph instructs his servants, return all their silver back into each of their sacks of grain, and take this silver cup of mine and put it in the sack of the youngest. And he sends them on their way with Simeon. And as they're leaving, he then tells his servant, go after them and stop them. And when the servant catches up to him, the servant says, how dare you return kindness with evil? You stolen my master's special silver cup that he uses for divination, for witchcraft type things. And you have taken it. And the brothers are like, what are you talking about? Why would we do that? We're just glad we're leaving with our necks. Right? They're terrified, and this is how confident they are that they didn't do anything wrong. They said, look, if you search our stuff, and if you find that silver cup, and the one who took it, that one will die, and the rest of us will become slaves of your master. And so he goes through, and he probably starts with Reuben, the oldest, and he opens up the sack all the way down to Benjamin. And when they open up the sack of Benjamin, there's the silver cup. And it says they all tore their robes. No! What is happening? Right? And so they all go back to Joseph's house. And Joseph comes out and goes, don't you know what kind of man I am? I know things. I can find things out through sorcery. And you did this. And they say, no, please, no. We didn't know what happened. We don't know what happened. And they're like, we're all your slaves. And he says, no, I don't need you to be slaves. The only one that should suffer is the one that took the cup. I'll keep him. And they're like, no. And Judah steps up and says, sir, look, you asked us about our family. We told you. You accused us of things, and we answered. We wanted to show we're honest men. And you asked us about our brother and our aged father. And we did all that, and you said, unless you bring your youngest brother here, you'll never see my face again. So we brought him here. But my father will die. He can't handle the grief of losing this son. And then Judah says this, take me, and let this boy go, because I can't stand to see the face of my father in grief if we don't bring Benjamin back. Now, while he's talking, let's pick up there, and I'm going to bring this thing to a close real quickly. Chapter 55, verse 1. Joseph could no longer control himself before his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph. He made himself known to his brothers, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him. And Pharaoh's household heard about it. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified. Right? Like, he's like, everybody out of the room. And he's like, ah! Right? He's like, I'm Joseph. And they're like, oh. They are petrified. But I want to pay attention to something he said. He said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, don't be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years there's been famine in the land, and in the next 5 there will be no plowing and reaping, but God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, to save your lives by a great deliverance. And then verse 8, so then it was not you who sent me here, but God. Notice this. Notice what he says to his brothers when he reveals himself. He says, guys, don't blame yourselves. God had a plan. And now I understand it. Now I see that all of the things that I went through was for this moment, to bring about a deliverance, because otherwise thousands upon thousands of people will die of starvation. It was God who did this, not you guys. He got it. He saw the fingerprints of God in his life. Now, Pharaoh was so excited that Joseph's family has been reunited, he gave them the best of the land. And when they went back and told Jacob, they're like, "It's Joseph." I imagine that would have been an awkward conversation. and Jacob's like, "I will go see my son." And they make their way back down to Egypt, and it's a beautiful scene when Joseph sees his father once again. And they embrace and weep. You see, when God does a work of restoration, it's not just that you no longer feel pain, you're forgiven of your sins. It's that he puts back the broken pieces. Marriages, families, churches. God is a God of restoration. Join with me in prayer. Thank you for your word, Lord. Thank you for showing us your work that you do and how there are circumstances that we can't ever fully explain. But you have a purpose, and you are good, and we can trust you. Lord, continue to restore us, heal our hurts, and restore our relationships. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.